This episode of The Great War is sponsored by Mack Weldon. Mack Weldon make men's clothing that focuses on high quality, well-designed basics for every occasion. Now we spend long days here in the studio filming The Great War, and I need my clothing to be comfortable and durable. Plus, I want to look as good as I can for the camera. Now in their easy-to-use web shop, we picked Mack Weldon's undershirts and this button-down shirt that I'm wearing right now, and I am sold. Even with the studio lights on, it's comfortable, it feels great, and it's extremely easy to iron, which is great for me since I'm terrible at ironing. Tony and Flo are both big fans of Mack Weldon's basic jacket, which looks sleek and has enough pockets to carry around all the basics on set. So if you're interested, check out their online shop that is a breeze to use and also offers great discounts if you order multiple items. Just go to mackweldon.com and use the promo code GREATWAR to get 20% off your first order. And now, on to the show. It's November 1919, and the Romanian army is pulling out of Budapest under Allied pressure. The Hungarian Soviet Republic is no more. But who will govern Hungary now? Hi, I'm Jesse Alexander, and welcome to The Great War. By late 1919, Central Europe was in a state of chaos, centered largely on the question of what would become of Hungary. The country had seen a Bolshevik revolution create the Hungarian Soviet Republic back in March, and conflict over borders led to fighting with Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Romania in April. The Allies, especially the French, managed to put a stop to the violence, but there was no easy solution in sight. By early May, foreign troops were still within Hungary's disputed frontiers, and Bolshevik leader Bela Kun's fragile alliance of committed Reds and reluctant nationalists was on the edge. Next door to the east, Romania was increasingly nervous about being caught between Bolshevik Russia and Soviet Hungary. Bucharest pushed the patience of the Big Four to the limit with its desire for a military line on the Tisza River, beyond the agreed demarcation lines. No one was satisfied with the situation, and it wouldn't be long before the tension boiled over again. Now, although the Romanian advance had stopped at the Tisza on May 1st, the leaders of the Hungarian Soviet Republic still feared another combined assault from three sides, just like in April. So they decided to shift the balance in their favor by taking the initiative. They weighed their options carefully and decided against attacking the strong Romanian positions on the Tisza. They couldn't really attack the Yugoslavs in the south because of the French troops there. So really there was only one possibility for success: to the north, against Czechoslovakia, the weakest opponent. But the Hungarians were divided about where to strike the Czechs. Aurel Stromfeld, the chief of the general staff, wanted to attack in the northwest, towards Nitra. He argued that this would secure Budapest and deal the Czechoslovak forces a crippling blow. But the commander-in-chief, Vilmos Böhm, and most of the other leadership favored a push to the northeast, towards Kassa or Košice. This would split the Czechoslovak and Romanian forces apart and allow for a further offensive against the Romanians from the area around Chap. Stromfeld's order of the day on May 26th read like this. For political and economic reasons, headquarters decided to cut through the inner flank of the Czech-Romanian forces, first to defeat the Czechs and, after the Tisza crossing, to attack the Romanians. Just as important as any military goals, the Hungarian Reds hoped that they could gain prestige by linking up with the Russian Bolsheviks in Ukraine and secure the future of the revolution in Central Europe. What they didn't know at the time was that the changing fronts in the civil war in Russia would make this impossible. On May 30th, the offensive began between the town of Luchenets and the Tisza River. The weak Czech units facing the Red Army were led by French and Italian officers who were not able to cooperate effectively. The Czechoslovaks fell back in disarray, and by June 5th, the Hungarians were near Košice. But just a few days later, the attack was called off. You see, despite the military success, the political situation had forced Kun's hand. The Big Four in Paris had issued another ultimatum to the belligerent armies in June, ordering them to return to the demarcation lines agreed to previously. Now, this was not the first such ultimatum. In fact, both sides had ignored several Allied demands in the past. But this time, Kun understood that the Romanians would also have to withdraw east of the Tisza, and he was prepared to trade his gains in the north for territory in the east, just as the Russian Bolsheviks had done earlier at Brest-Litovsk in 1918. But Kun also had other problems on his hands. He supported the creation of a Slovak Socialist Republic in mid-June, but this would prove to be quite controversial. His objective was to spread the revolution and play for time, but many of his officers and troops were more interested in restoring these lands to Hungary than creating a new revolutionary republic. Morale dropped, and Böhm resigned. As if that weren't enough, revolts against Soviet rule had to be put down in Budapest and Sopron in early June, and a Hungarian-supported Bolshevik coup attempt in Vienna failed. On June 28th, Kun agreed to give up the lands that he'd won, and an armistice was signed on July 6th. Peter Augustin signed the document for the Hungarian Soviet Republic and noted in his diary, "I signed the armistice agreement because we want to support the Austrians in order to establish a Soviet system there. It seems French General Mittelhauser has no inkling that the Red Army is now very weak, and for this reason we surrendered those extensive territories in Upper Hungary." But the Romanians did not budge from their position on the Tisza, since they'd not been consulted by the Big Four about withdrawing. Kun protested to the French, but they refused to pressure their ally. The Romanians had defied French wishes before, and the country was a linchpin in the French policy of containing Bolshevik Russia. Hungary was in an uproar, and the communist government came under intense pressure. Their foreign policy had failed, and their support within Hungary was crumbling. A desperate move was in the cards. But before we jump into what comes next, let's take a moment to focus on the diplomacy in Paris and what the Allies thought of the changing situation in Central Europe. In May and June, the Big Four in Paris struggled to agree on a policy in the region. It didn't help that in the late spring, most of their attention was still on the coming treaty with Germany. One British journalist remarked after a meeting with David Lloyd George and General Wilson, "It was quite obvious that the Big Four had hardly given the countries east of Germany a thought, being far too occupied with the principal offender to bother about lesser minions." Now, the Big Four did want to stop the fighting so the border questions could be ironed out, but they also feared what might happen if the Hungarian and Russian Reds established contact and were able to spread the revolution. They grew frustrated as all the regional players had ignored several requests to stop the violence. David Lloyd George at one point simply stated, "They're all little brigand peoples who only want to steal territories." But the Entente's ability to impose their will, in spite of the French army on the Danube, was limited. There was simply no desire in the Allied publics for another war, especially far from home, as the US military representative in Budapest observed. If the three great powers had been able to keep armies and could have sent them immediately to any place where trouble was brewing, it would have been different. But the Supreme Council's prestige went a-glimmering when a steady stream of ultimata had no effect whatever upon that miserable little nation of Romania. Clemenceau said that he would only support all-out military intervention if the US and UK also joined, but neither was willing. An exasperated Wilson asked Lloyd George and Clemenceau, "Do we have a way of stopping the movement of the Romanians?" They did not. And to make things more complicated, Allied politicians and military leaders didn't always agree amongst themselves. Clemenceau was supportive of Romania, but cautious, since Romania had, after all, concluded a separate peace with the Central Powers in 1918 before re-entering the war on November 10th. Generals Franchet d'Espéry and Berthelot, on the other hand, urged a Romanian attack to wipe out the Soviet Republic in Hungary and firmly establish an anti-Bolshevik cordon sanitaire. General Berthelot even referred to Romania as, quote, "the best French colony in the world," though he was rebuked by Clemenceau for his overly aggressive advice. Romania also had some difficult choices to make that summer. Should they finish off Hungary or not? Since their victory in April, they had renewed confidence in their military strength, and they were also worried about the Bolshevik threat from Russia in the east, since Lenin was demanding that they give up Bessarabia and Bukovina. But there was an advantage to letting the weak and isolated Hungarian Soviet Republic survive, since it had no support from the Entente. The king agreed to withdraw Romanian troops if the Allies promised to intervene in case of a future Hungarian attack against Romania. But such a guarantee was not provided. Prime Minister Brătianu defended his position to the Big Four. I fear that you are not perfectly informed about the role of the Romanian army and the Hungarian provocations. So the fighting in April had not solved anything, and the diplomats had not made any progress either. Now the Romanians were split on whether to attack again, and the Hungarian Bolsheviks were on the verge of collapse. You see, by the middle of July, Kun was in a dilemma. He'd sacrificed the territories he'd won, but he'd gotten nothing in return. His regime was on very shaky ground, and his attempts to spread the revolution in Slovakia and Austria and to get support from Russia had failed. He decided there was only one option left, one last desperate attack against the Romanians. On July 12th, the Hungarian Soviet Republic ordered universal conscription and shifted troops to the east to form the Army of the Tisza. The attack would coincide with a planned European general strike against the intervention in Hungary on July 21st. But the Hungarians faced very long odds. The Red Army's 30,000 troops and 300 guns were outmatched by the Romanian Army's 84,000 men, 12,000 cavalry, and 400 guns. Morale, discipline, and organization in the Red Army was now quite poor, and several units had to be disbanded by the new commander, Jenő Landler. Some others simply refused to move up to the front. To make matters worse for the Hungarians, an Italian officer in Budapest had been given the plans for the offensive, so the Romanians knew that it was coming. The Hungarian Red Army nonetheless attacked on July 20th. At first, some progress was made, and the Hungarian units crossed the river and advanced up to 60 kilometers in some places. But the Romanians brought up their reserves and struck back on July 24th. By the 30th, the Romanian army under General Mărdarescu was crossing the Tisza, and the king and queen even came to watch. Now by this stage, the Hungarian Red Army had collapsed, and resistance to the Romanian advance was slight. Kun rushed to the front to rally his troops, but the soldiers simply shouted back at him, "We have already fought enough. Fight yourselves, comrades." Staff Officer Iulia noted in his diary, "The troops did not want to fight anymore, at any price." On August 1st, Bela Kun and the rest of the governing council of the Hungarian Soviet Republic resigned. Kun addressed his fellow communists. "I no longer have a voice. I only have the belief that the proletariat that left not me, its leader, in the lurch, but left itself in the lurch, is still a proletariat that is not at fault, because it was not possible to make out of capitalism, out of this squalid, this loathsome capitalism, anything else than that squalid and loathsome system that there was in this country. The dictatorship of the proletariat has collapsed in Hungary." Realizing all was lost, Kun fled to Austria. The Social Democrat Gyula Peidl formed a new government, but events were out of his control, and the local councils and Red Army units simply disbanded on their own. On August 4th, Romanian troops marched into Budapest without a shot being fired. Premier Brătianu was jubilant. "The victory refreshed my soul. These 7 days have been the best in my political life." So after 4 months, the Hungarian Soviet Republic was no more, and Romanian troops occupied most of the country. So let's take a moment to look at what went wrong for the Bolsheviks in Hungary. Now first off, Soviet Hungary was completely isolated. The dream of joining up with Bolshevik Russia had never materialized, and attempts to spread the revolution locally in Austria and Czechoslovakia failed miserably. Alone, Hungary had no chance in a war against its neighbors, who enjoyed Entente support, especially when the desperate Red Army attacks had no clear and achievable military goals. Internally, support was lacking as well. Inflation, corruption, and the Red Terror all contributed to chaos and suffering in the country. The regime alienated nearly all sectors of society. Catholics because of its atheism, business owners because of its nationalization policy, the aristocracy because of its land policy, the officer class because of its internationalism, and moderate social democrats and liberals because of its opposition to democracy. Perhaps most importantly, it also alienated the peasants, the largest group in Hungarian society, who did not want to sell their land to the state and resisted fiercely. Even amongst the Budapest workers, the core of Kun's supporters, support quickly ebbed away. A Red Commissar in Western Hungary reported on the hopeless situation in May. In this region, many villages are in revolt, and to re-establish order, real battles must be waged. When the peasants cannot rebel openly, they tolerate our rule with suppressed rage. If the workers were revolutionary enough, we could easily deal with the peasants. But the workers are not capable of sacrifice. So, instead of a Soviet regime that was opposed by most, much of Hungary was now occupied by the Romanian army, and the terms of the armistice they proposed made for some controversy. The August armistice terms demanded Hungary disarm and submit to occupation. 40,000 Red Army troops also became prisoners of war. In addition, the Romanian government demanded reparations in kind. Hungary was to hand over locomotives, rail cars, farm machinery, riverboats, wheat, and military equipment for 30,000 men. Almost immediately, the Allies set up a commission to supervise the occupation and Hungarian disarmament. But there was no Romanian representative on that commission, and relations between the Romanians and the Allies, chiefly the French, were tense. The Romanians expected that the Allies would be pleased that they'd finally removed the Bolshevik threat to the heart of Europe. Instead, the Allies, already annoyed their instructions to the Romanians over the previous months had often been ignored, were unhappy with the reports of widespread looting and pillaging. Like other countries, Romania had suffered severe economic hardship during the war, and after their defeat by the Central Powers, all sorts of food and equipment had been seized. Now, many felt that they had the right to do the same in Hungary. A Polish envoy in Budapest, Baron Jan Sembek, was appalled by what he called, quote, the barbaric and extremely destructive occupation. When an American officer complained to Queen Mary, she replied, "You may call it stealing if you want to, or any other name, but I feel that we are perfectly entitled to do what we want to." By November, the Entente decided that the Romanians and others should withdraw from Hungary to the borders proposed by the Peace Conference Commission. The problem was, it wasn't quite clear what sort of government would replace them, and whether some sort of measure of stability could be restored. Though one well-known historian has said that Hungary's next government was, quote, more stable than the Soviet Republic, this so-called stability would come at a price. So the Romanians left Budapest on November 14th, and the occupation of the city came to an end. The movement that now stepped into the gap and took power in Hungary had been waiting for this moment for months. Now, back when the Bolshevik Revolution succeeded in March, more than 100,000 Hungarians fled the new regime and took refuge in Austria. Many of the refugees were aristocrats and officers who were opposed to the communist regime and in favor of restoring the Kingdom of Hungary. They formed the so-called Vienna Committee in the hopes of returning to Budapest when the time was right. At the same time, in French-occupied Szeged, another anti-Bolshevik group began to organize under French protection. They were led by Count Gyula Karolyi, whose cousin Mihaly had led Hungary until the communist takeover. But they also had links to radical right-wing groups. Now, these two groups made common cause and merged in an uneasy alliance, and Karolyi appointed Miklos Horthy Minister for War. Their plan was to hold elections based on universal suffrage and form a constitutional government. But they still needed a military, so Horthy began to organize the National Army in June. Now, a major challenge the conservative counter-revolutionaries faced was gaining the support of the French. The French were suspicious of the Karolyi group and saw them as reactionary, sympathetic to the monarchy, and Germanophile. But they did share a common anti-Bolshevik position. French General Charpy assured the Szeged government, "Wherever the French are, there is no communism." Karolyi tried hard to get French support for a march on Budapest, but could get no more than a promise of neutrality. So he and Horthy both resigned their cabinet posts. Horthy became commander-in-chief of the National Army and remained the most important figure in the stalled counter-revolutionary government. Meanwhile, in Budapest, once the Soviet government had collapsed, yet another governing group emerged. Just 2 days after the Social Democrat Paidel took over the reins in the capital, he was driven out in a bloodless coup on August 6th. The takeover had long been planned by the radical right-wing and anti-Semitic White House group, but was co-opted by the more moderate politician István Friedrich, with tacit Romanian approval. Friedrich became prime minister and named Joseph of Habsburg, a distant cousin of the former emperor, provisional governor. The Allies were not happy with this turn of events. Neither were the Czechoslovaks, who feared a Habsburg restoration. Foreign Minister Edvard Beneš wrote to Clemenceau, "What is going on in Hungary now under Joseph von Habsburg is extremely dangerous for the peace of Central Europe. This will lead exactly to the same result as under the Bela Kun government. That is, to an extremely deep hostility of Hungary to all the neighboring states." Despite the fact that most of Friedrich's ministers were Democrats from the pre-Bolshevik cabinet, Allied opinion remained firmly suspicious of the Habsburg connection. Friedrich wanted to avoid an endless cycle of violence and called for calm. The government is filled not with revenge, but with the spirit of compassion and conciliation. But for all Friedrich's good intentions, he still lacked a military. The only Hungarian armed force in the country was Horthy's National Army, which had 3,000 men in August, and it soon made itself felt. Now, the army consisted of regular units alongside paramilitary militias, like those led by Baron Pál Prone and Ivan Helyas. Now, these paramilitaries were the primary perpetrators of the White Terror as they advanced into the countryside late that summer. In theory, they were motivated by revenge against the Bolsheviks, and they did execute some who were responsible for the Red Terror, but they also acted as hired killers. They associated the Soviet Republic with the Jews, and these became the prime target of their murderous activity. By the time the White Terror was over in 1921, between 1,000 and 3,000 people had been killed. Now, though the degree of Horthy's involvement in the atrocities remains a topic of debate, he did write this later. "I have no reason to gloss over deeds of injustice and atrocities committed when an iron broom alone could sweep the country clean." Once the Romanian troops withdrew, Horthy's National Army advanced on Budapest, and he entered the city on November 16th. He soon took control of the government, and under his rule, the White Terror would continue to rage. The hopes of those Hungarians who wished to see a return to the goals of the October 1918 revolution had been dashed. All right, so by the end of 1919, the fighting in Central Europe had stopped, but real stability was still a distant prospect. Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia had gained territory, but a peace treaty had not yet been signed. Romania had nearly achieved the goal of Romania Mare, or Greater Romania, and some viewed the defeat of Hungary as retribution for 1,000 years of oppression. The French departed Central Europe without having reached their objective of a friendly, democratic Hungarian government. And as for Hungary, it was a society burning with resentment. There was still hatred between left and right within the country, the White Terror continued, and many felt a great historical injustice was being inflicted by the great powers. And the coming peace treaty would only stoke those fears. Now, as usual, you can find all our sources for this video in the video description, including the links to our Amazon stores. To get access to all our podcast episodes with expert interviews and other perks, you can also support us on Patreon or by clicking the join button below. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is The Great War 1919, a production of Real Time History and the only YouTube history channel who sees the incredible irony in an admiral becoming the head of a landlocked country.